Hi everyone. I think it's 3 o'clock now, which means I can actually start speaking. Welcome. Got some quotes up here. Not going to really come back to these. These were in the session description, but I want you to think about whether these are from video game reviews or from medieval commentaries about documents. And I'll come back to something like this as we speak more. But I really love these quotes because it's really hard to tell if I'm talking about video games or whether these are medieval document quotes. And again, I'll come back to this stuff. Welcome to the weird talk. This is my medieval knights and giant snails talk. I hope everyone is in the right place and was expecting to be in this talk. Cool. Okay, I move around a lot, so if I drift away from the microphone, somebody throw something at me. I'm used to having a microphone clipped to me rather than having to stay in one spot. So I apologize if I move too far from the microphones. Please shout at me if I do that, okay? I'm Paris. I help run Secret Lab. We think we're Tasmania's longest running game development studio. We're not 100% sure on that, but we're pretty sure. Secret Lab is on the land of the Muanina people, which is in the revived Aboriginal language Paloakani, and is in Nipaluna, which is also known as Hobart. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Sovereignty was never ceded, and it's important to point that out as many times as we can. This is Hobart, Nipaluna. You should visit. Hobart's amazing. We have more fibre to the premises than any other state, better coffee than Melbourne, and Screen Tasmania funds video games. So you should definitely go to Tasmania. Literal paradise. I am part of Tasmanian Game Makers, which is newly properly incorporated. We're pretty great. Professionally, at Secret Lab, we build video games for all sorts of clients. This is one we built recently, which is basically like Untitled Goose Game, except we built it for a power company, and you play a quoll that's designed, that needs to run up people's power bills by sneaking into people's houses. It's a lot of fun. We're also really well known for our work on Night in the Woods. We're finishing the iOS version of that right now. And Yarn Spinner, the narrative game framework, which is really popular. Please come and talk to us if you're doing stuff with Yarn or Yarn Spinner or narrative video games in general. We'd love to talk to you. This talk is about none of those things, though. Oh yeah, we also write a lot of books. We've written nearly 30 books. Here are some of the most recent ones. You can buy our books if you want. Again, the talk has nothing to do with any of our books. Normally I do proper serious video game development, programming, machine learning, things like that. And I speak a lot, and I feel like I know what I'm doing with regards to video game development, computer science, stuff like that. I'm obviously a very important person, and I have a silly name. So I figured that I should give a talk that befits my very silly name. I just want to reinforce that I'm a very serious professional. I have a PhD in computer science and everything. However, last year at GCAP, I gave a talk for a bit of a laugh about pirates. It was about pirates, Caribbean pirates, actual pirates, and how they have a lot in common with actual game development and game developers. And people seem to really like it. I submitted it not expecting it to get accepted, and it was really fun. You can watch it on YouTube if you want to take a photo. That's the URL. I quite liked it. You might like it too. Either way, following that last year, and I had a really good experience doing a completely irrelevant talk, I submitted another talk this year about a similarly unrelated subject. About medieval marginalia, medieval art, medieval books in general. See, it also turns out, I think I can make a point about the game industry, kind of, but I also think game developers should learn history. I was really glad to see in the keynote from Anne LeMay yesterday that she also reinforced that a wide education is really useful for everybody. So, prior to my computer science education, I actually have a history degree as well. And history was my first love, so I'm here to give you a proper history lecture. That's what we're going to do for the rest of this session. So there's a very tenuous, tiny link to video games. Some of the keener-eyed among you may spot it as I go through my slides. But this is mostly just a history talk, okay? It's a little talk on a slice of history, particularly history of books, history of creating books, and how they're created. There's a little bit of Monty Python in here as well. Okay? Thank you to the GDA for letting me give this very silly talk at a game creation event. I really appreciate that. Before I get started, medieval art can get a bit weird. There's some like slightly gory stuff in here, slightly sexualized things. There's a lot of asses. I've censored some of the more erotic components. It's nothing too bad, but I'll try and give you some warnings if I think something's particularly weird or might bother some people. Feel free to wander out or shield your eyes if you don't like that sort of thing. I will not be offended. I just don't want anyone to be alarmed by some of the imagery. It's a little bit different to what you see in the other talks. That said, video games are full of awful violence, so you'll probably be fine. There are a couple of things we need to define as we go. The first one is, what is medieval? So Medieval is sometimes called the Middle Ages. This is an absolute garbage term. There are a lot of strongly worded papers from historians about this. Historians think it's a poor term. You can tell because they write papers with titles like this. Middle Ages implies positioning. They don't like it being called middle, because middle implies it's between two interesting bits, and it's not the interesting bit. So don't call anything medieval the Middle Ages. That's a bad term. Call it medieval, even though that means we're not going to go there. If you get one takeaway from this talk, please call this era medieval. So the medieval period has a whole bunch of subdivisions. I'm also not going to go into this today. I'm just talking about the medieval period as a whole. We're going to blur it all together. So the primary content of this relates to medieval as a whole, which is kind of 300 to 1600, plus or minus 1,000 years on either end, depending on your opinion. If you're interested in learning more history, you can tweet at me and I'll answer your questions afterwards. I did a lot of research for this talk. I do a lot of research about this stuff in general. I really like history. Please, or find me at the conference. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you hated it and you think I'm polluting the beautiful video game content. Whatever you would like. I'd love to talk to you about it. Or just do a history degree. History degrees are really good. So, medieval period between 300, 1600, give or take. Some historians also go back and forth on either side. It doesn't really matter. This session is about the whole medieval period. In the medieval period, books and documents are a pretty special, rare, interesting thing. So all of the art in this, except for the obvious Monty Python bits, is real medieval art. And I'll explain some of it. So books and documents are a really special thing in this era, because books and manuscripts, after many centuries of writing on stone tablets, and eventually scrolls of papyrus and parchment had finally started arriving. As an aside, parchment is made from animal skins and papyrus is made from the pith of this plant, which is called the papyrus plant. So papyrus is a different thing to parchment. Video games mix that up all the time and get it wrong, so you should get that right next time you do that in video game. Parchment, dead animals. Papyrus, dead plant. Very, very simple. Anyway, the medieval period started around the 5th century. Roman Empire had fallen. Roman culture was gone, okay? So Rome was declining in Europe. The Romans had a very particular way of doing things and they were leaving. They were gone. That means contact with Egypt was also reduced, so the Egyptians were gone as well. That means they stopped using papyrus, okay? They went back to parchment, which was a much older technology. Egyptians made papyrus. Europe did not have papyrus. So they went back to parchment. A lot easier to write things on dead animals. Very simple. Parchment, very old technology, came back into vogue. So they started writing on parchment. Romans had loved to write things, though, and one bit of the Roman culture that survived was writing. Romans absolutely loved to write things. They also loved to copy existing things. It was a big deal. Romans were just gagging for it. They absolutely loved to write, read, copy. Very, very Roman. And certain groups that sprung up around this era, like the Benedictines, what they did was not important. They were a very specific monastic group. They also loved reading. They were just gagging for reading. They came up with the whole quiet times for reading and told their followers to do that accordingly. They told them it was a pious thing to do, to read, to write. It was super important to them. They created whole orders around this idea of reading and writing. Really big in the religious classes, basically. Huge deal. And as I said, the Romans loved it as well. The Romans also loved documentation, records, things like that. So this Roman culture of writing and reading merged with the emerging medieval culture of also writing and reading and came up with a whole new version of it. Basically medieval writing. And this unique recognizable style of medieval book appeared just after the Romans left, which is probably what people associate with medieval books, this kind of big lettery thing. You know, you can get fonts that look like this. So even if you don't really recognize it as medieval, you kind of know it looks like a medieval font. Very, very recognizable. As a reminder, writing, book copying, was a very human-based process. It was mostly done in monasteries at this time, but the occasional wealthy person employed someone privately to do it, like the Jeff Bezos of the medieval era probably had like a room full of people who would make books for him. In monasteries and other places where books were made, it was called a scriptorium. It was usually located directly above the meeting room. So when you have a church or a monastery with the big vaulted room, then above that is another little room where they lock the people who make the books. It was a safe place. It was a very safe place deliberately so. It was structurally a safe place because they had like prohibitions on lighting. So lighting meant fire, so it usually had natural light. They didn't want to damage the manuscripts, things like that. It's a very specific place in the buildings. In the scriptorium, the development team for books and manuscripts worked. So this is a team of people who were dedicated to making and producing books. And that development team had a bunch of very specific roles. Okay? I'm glad that landed, because I've been changing that picture several times. Okay, so our book development team had a whole bunch of roles. Very, very specific roles. There were copyists who performed production of books. They handled correspondence with the commissioner, the person who asked for the book to be made, and did high-level technical work. So they prepared the book to be ready, and they prepared manuscripts, things like that. Illuminators, they illustrated the book and designed its layout. So the illuminators were the ones who were responsible for drawing things and figuring out where things went on a page. They were really important. Rubricators, which is a great word. I think I'm going to call myself a rubricator from now on, but rubricators painted the red letters. Anyone ever played Half-Life 2, I think? It says a red letter day. You know, when something's called a red letter day, it's an important day. It starts with a red letter. Chapters start with a red letter. That's where that comes from. There are also correctors who collated and then did testing and verification. They kind of QA. They verified that the content that needed to be there was there and did some serious quality control on the books. They made sure it was all correct. And there were calligraphers who actually coordinated production and took care of fine details. Calligraphy wasn't the overall art. Calligraphy was very specifically making sure it was really high quality. Lots and lots of different roles involved in making a book in this era. Lots of roles, okay? So lots of different people, very manual, hand process. Books took a very long time to make as well. The bookmaking process was huge and unwieldy, okay? It had to be ready on schedule in order to make it to the bookbinder, who typically didn't work in one place for very long and went around binding books for various monasteries, things like that. Everyone had deadlines to meet. It was a very complicated, minute, human-based task that relied on very precise deadline management, because otherwise people didn't get what they needed. Some development teams introduced new innovations that initially confused or got criticized, and then were later adopted by everyone else. Okay? A really great example of this is the idea of spacing between words. Okay? So, this was invented by an Irish team in the 7th century, and they were ridiculed by everybody. Okay? It was a big change, and people did not like it. Interestingly, it flags the transition from semi-vocalized reading into silent reading. So people actually started reading silently when the words were able to be read without vocalizing them. So this was a really important innovation and made the industry able to get bigger. Okay? If you're interested in this specific thing, this is a really good, really easily readable book for non-historians to learn about how writing evolved. This is fascinating stuff. I highly recommend this book. It's on Amazon. You can buy it from today's Jeff Bezos. So, books also had DRM, desk rights management, in that they were fitted with clasps and straps, and they were chained to the desks so people didn't steal them. I'm serious, they were chained to the desks so people didn't steal them. This was really important because they initially didn't do this, and then books got thefted and burnt and all sorts of stuff. So monasteries where the books were kept chained their books to the desk. The rich people had books, they chained them to the desk. This is why ye olde magic books in like medieval games have chains and clasps on them. This is where that comes from. They were legitimately there so they could chain them to the desk. And some of the really old libraries around the world still have these chain libraries where you can go and look at all old stuff. It's really cool. In the 12th and 13th century, universities became a thing and the book industry just exploded because universities needed books, okay? At this point, a thing that historians actually legit, I shit you not. Can I swear? I did. Okay, sorry. Sorry. Manuscript culture, right? It's a thing called manuscript culture. It had arrived. Book demand increased and this thing called manuscript culture arrived. And manuscript culture came with a lot of things. And the biggest thing that manuscript culture came with was an increase in technology, okay? Technology just got better and better, which means more books got produced. The demand for books rose, even more books got produced. It was a really big deal, and books started to be, relatively speaking, absolutely freaking everywhere, okay? Stationers' guilds appeared to produce the massive amounts of books and manuscripts that people were desperate to consume, and they kind of unionized in a way. Modern union would not recognize this as a union, but it is effectively a union. The industry got very, very, very large. Too large, by all accounts, and it was just terrifyingly large. Remember, this is all before the era of printing, and books and manuscripts are something that's produced with a lot of labor by hand, so we're not talking printing presses here, we're talking everything is a manual, human-based process. People are involved at all steps of this, okay? Manuscript culture created jobs in cities, so big powerhouse cities started popping up where manuscript culture rose up around the making and the trade of these manuscripts, and the support infrastructure for manuscripts existed in these cities. And these cities started to think they were pretty hot shit. Some powerful manuscript-making cities had so much of the manuscript industry in a given region, they often forgot other cities existed at all. It was a legitimate problem. All of this is real history. And as part of this, they created events where they would gather and discuss how they would make manuscripts. They threw week-long conferences on manuscripts. The Fourth Council of the Lateran, which is a biblical one, is one example of that you may have heard of. People came from far and wide to go to these cities to attend these meetings, to make contacts and network and get drunk. And it made the power of these cities more concentrated. It was a really, really big deal, okay? Manuscript development was meticulous, creative, technical, complex work, and manuscript developers were careful, clever people who performed quality work. But they did not do so mindlessly. They thought about what they were doing, okay? They were really thoughtful about their work. At their conferences, they deeply considered their art and how it would affect other people. There's evidence, for example, in particular texts about herbal medicine, of the monks who were working on the copying and the creation of the content, who, upon receiving the original source material, decided to take it upon themselves to grow all the herbs in the book and test all the recipes, and then update the book accordingly without the permission of the person who commissioned the book. They basically wanted to make sure it was correct, and they grew all the plants in question to test out the material in the book and then updated it accordingly and published it. And they got in trouble for that, but also it survived in a more interesting way. This is also the reason why when you look at medieval bestiaries, you see lots of fantastical creatures that don't exist. That's because monks could grow plants and test those. They couldn't grow or ever see lions and had no idea what a lion was, so it was very easy to say a lion has wings and 10 feet teeth, right? So they made a lot of stuff up about things they didn't know about and improved all the stuff they could directly talk about. Basically, the people creating these books were not mindless. They were careful, clever, and proud of their work, and they thought about their art and their craft and how it affected them and the people around them. Really important. They were very creative. There was an awful lot of creativity in their work, and a lot of creativity. Does anyone recognize this game? Okay, you should research this game if you don't recognize it. Google Australian games, and you'll find it. Throughout this era of manuscript culture, a lot of manuscript developers left personal touches throughout their work. Lots of personal touches. Marginalia is the term for marks made in the margins of a document or a book, okay? This is a turnip person. I'm not sure what this is, but it's marginalia. It's great. It's radish, maybe? Yeah, not sure. It's pretty cool. I really like this one. I use this as my Twitter avatar for about a week there. You know, like the meme, it me. It's a good deal. Marginalia was left extensively throughout the era of manuscript culture by the developers and the creators of these manuscripts and books. And there's some really ridiculous stuff out there. Some of the earliest examples are liturgical notes left in the margins of biblical documents by monks who created them, intended as guidance to use them better. So this is an example. The little signboard is basically a post-it note that says, do this. This is the good stuff right here. It's a very helpful, sensible thing. As an aside, one of the most recognizable examples is Fermat's last theorem, which was actually written as a piece of marginalia much later on. So Fermat just left it in the margins and then somebody else found it. But most of it's just a personal touch left by the illustrators and the creators of these books. They couldn't help but add personal touches to these books and documents because they're creative, passionate people doing a job that they mostly really enjoyed, okay? The personal touches vary wildly, from slightly demented doodling to full-on illustrations. They're great. I love these. Many of them are simply medieval comedy. These are some monks either eating or regurgitating a frog. Not totally clear on that right now. And we can kind of figure out what manuscript developers were getting at with a little research. This is a particularly good one. This looks like something out of Alice in Wonderland, but it's just amazing. A really good primary source to consult to figure out what they're thinking when they built these is medieval bestiaries, books of beasts, which are a particular genre of manuscripts created in England primarily, which present collections of animals, as I mentioned a minute ago. It's also explained what the symbolism of these animals was. So most of them are Christian, but some of them are other religions. For example, panthers were thought to be a multicolored beast with a very sweet smell that would attract other animals. The beaver would cut off its own testicles because it knew the hunter wanted them and would leave the beaver alone if the beaver provided them to the hunter. The foul dragon was the devil, which was the only archenemy of the elephant and the panther, aka Jesus. It's hard to find the links these days, but the explanation is there. There's lots of different symbolism. One you may be very familiar with is from Monty Python, because many of these medieval marginalia have come into 21st and 20th century pop culture. One of those is the rabbit from Monty Python. If you're not familiar with this, please go and watch Monty Python's Holy Grail. It's fabulous. But it's also full of references to medieval marginalia. Rabbits were all over the place. They were just obsessed with rabbits. Pliny the Elder, who is a famous writer of the era-ish, wrote, "The fertility of rabbits is enormous. By eating all the crops, rabbits brought famine to the Balearic Islands, to such an extent that the people there petitioned Augustus to send troops to fight the beasts. That's true. It's Natural History, Book 8. Rabbits were freaking terrifying, so a lot of medieval documents refer to these freaking terrifying rabbits. Now, realistically, rabbits caused death through famine, which is why they were scary, but as they got transposed through eras of books, they became terrifying. I mean, you know, slightly delirious monks doing transcriptions often drew rabbits wielding swords and stuff like that. Some of the marginalia was just straight up doodles, ranting about all sorts of things. This is an elephant carrying a cart of drunk people. Not really sure what's going on there. Who hasn't ridden an elephant when drunk? Honestly, this is an example of a 9th century Irish marginalia doodle. It's the thing up the top there, which is in Ogham, which is an old medieval alphabet. This says, pretty much verbatim, "The ale, it has killed us. I have a massive hangover." So, you know, the scribes weren't without a sense of humour, and they left marks. You'll notice the text is not in Ogham, yet the doodle is. So presumably that means something. There's also an amazing manuscript, which is utterly thrilling reading, I assure you, laying out the rules for joining the Poulterers Guild. The Poulterers Guild is the guild that did chicken things. The body of the manuscript says that female members are not allowed to have male apprentices because it's up to the man to rule the woman, according to this guide. And somebody in the margin has doodled, "not always." So, I particularly like that one. As another aside, the Poulterers Guild still exists. It's called the Worshipful Company of Poulterers, and their surprisingly sinister motto is "Remember your oath." They also use Facebook. You can join them if you do chicken things. I'm really not sure how to join them, but I did tell them their SSL certificate has expired. There's a whole bunch more scribblings about the emotional and the physical state of the book producers and the book creators, such as "God bless my hands today," which exists in this one, and then there's the little guide whose hands are presumably blessed. Some of them even complained about their health. This is a particularly good one. "The phlegm is upon me like a mighty river, and my breathing is laboured." So he's probably not feeling too well. Some people even talk about their pets. This is a nice little poemy one, where they're basically sitting there with their cat, which has a name, talking about how the cat is hunting mice while they're up all night writing. And you know, we can relate to these people once we start looking at the stuff they wrote while they were creating. This is a pretty good one. "May God forgive Edmund the putting of the colour on this book on the eve of Sunday." Edmund clearly didn't feel like he'd done a very good job at the time. It gets better. "Pray for Maelbright, who wrote this book in his 28th year." Wasn't feeling very good, poor Maelbright. And then we see things like this. Some of the marginalia is just silly illustrations, which aren't even that good or particularly well done. They really just resemble the sort of thing you might see in a high school student's book. I've definitely drawn something that looks like this. This also looks like that poor woman who cleaned the picture of Jesus a few years ago and redrew it. Anyone remembers that? That's what this reminded me of. But this is ancient. This is like 1100. There's a few of these. They're basically terrible high school doodles of skeletons and other spooky things. Not sure what that is. It's fairly atrocious. But most of them are really lavish. Most of them look like this. Again, there's a lot of regurgitating and or eating beasts. Not really sure what's going on there. These are two monks who have either decapitated each other or themselves and are now having a good old chinwag about it. Not really sure. Here is a monk who has the body of a dog. There's a donkey playing a harp or a lyre, maybe. Here is a fearsome chicken snail thing. Marginalia was a really big thing. There's a lot of it. And to answer the question from the talk's title, why are there so many snails, basically, we don't really know. Okay, so there's a lot of snails. There's a really huge amount of snails in these medieval marginalia. People just loved snails. There are a few theories as to why there's so many snails, though, so I'm just going to take you through a few of those before I do some parting thoughts. The first theory is that snails represent death, or the resurrection. Is a snail coming down from on high to tell you you're dead? I'm not really sure, but that's what I think it says. And one of the first people to pick up on the amount of snails in medieval marginalia was the Comte de Bastard, that's his name, in 1850. He noticed that there were some manuscripts with snails close to manuscripts of talking about the raising of Lazarus from the Bible. Jesus brings Lazarus of Bethany, I think, back to life 4 days after his burial, so it's a raising of the dead. This led the Comte de Bastard to theorise that snails must represent the resurrection. The two images must be linked in his mind. So maybe snails represent death or the resurrection, we're not really sure. Another more modern historian, Lisa Spangenberg, who highlights biblical connections in Psalm 58. There's something that says punishment for the wicked shall make them be like a snail. So maybe the knights fighting the snails are actually fighting the wicked, and they just didn't want to draw the wicked, so they drew a snail. We're not really sure. There's also the slightly racist theory that snails represent the Lombards. So the Lombards were a Germanic people who were on the Italian peninsula in much of the medieval period, and they were considered by other parts of medieval Europe as an unchivalrous, violent bunch. So placing them in marginalia is like a bit of xenophobic fun and poking fun at them. So we're not really sure why the knights would always be depicted as losing if it was the Lombards, though. So that theory isn't necessarily accurate. But this is a popular theory. The theory I like the most is that the snails are satire. So if we look back 100 or 200 years, so relatively recent, it's actually hard to understand some humour. Like what they found funny is not necessarily what we find funny just because of the cultural context. So this theory is that basically the idea that instead of showing the knights fighting off actual enemies, the idea that showing knights fighting slow-moving tiny snails as big is a mockery of chivalry and that kind of whole thing there. The knights are often shown cowering in terror or losing, as I said, so this might just be a humorous parody of knights in arms, and this is a way of just making fun of knights. Knights claim to be big and brave, but they can't actually beat a snail, showing their true cowardice. It's hilarious, you know, medieval belly laughs all around. This is the theory. It makes an unworthy foe for all this jousting gear, so it's inherently quite funny if you're a medieval person. There's also the theory that snails represent social climbers, poor versus rich. Knights, very wealthy. Snails, not very wealthy. It's possibly a social commentary. Again, we don't really know. So I think we just need to enjoy them rather than trying to make meaning of them these days. Snails have no weapons with which to fight the rich people above them. The knights do. That might be the joke. Who really cares? It's really pretty art. We should enjoy it, what we've got left. So maybe snails represent one of many things. It doesn't really matter. Snails are really pretty to look at. Snails are often shown on ladders, which is possibly lends credence to that social climbers idea. We're not really sure. I really like this one because this looks like you could make a video game out of this. I'm not really sure how you would, but I like it. I think it's just a bit of fun. I really, really like looking at snail pictures, and there's a lot of them. So instead of representing something deep and meaningful, the snails are kind of like modern comics. Maybe like slightly less modern newspaper comics, so they're kind of good enough to get you to roll your eyes and smile, but not good enough to make you laugh. Kind of like Pickles, if everyone ever read the Saturday newspaper. Snails are like that. It's humorous to see a brave knight cowering in terror at a harmless snail, but it's not belly laugh humorous to us. So we might never know. There's all sorts of cool snail pictures though, and I really, really enjoy looking at them. One thing I really like about all this marginalia is that it's actually really just old-fashioned promotional art. So the people who worked on these manuscripts and the people responsible for doodling these marginalia or doodling these lavish illustrations was known. It wasn't like they were anonymous. So it was kept in records. Monasteries loved records because the Romans loved records. And they kept records of who built and designed and created all the documents and books they were working on. They weren't just anonymous blobs. They were known, they were indexed, they were meticulously recorded. They received credits. People knew who did what, okay? And the people working on these projects, the artists and the creators, they wanted to work on other projects. They would like to expand their skill set. They would like to work in more jobs around the world. Their world being very small, but the world. And if the project they were working on didn't necessarily reflect their full skill set, no matter how much they enjoyed it, they wanted to add more things to show off what they could actually do. Marginalia was often a medieval social network. So it was a way to show off the skills of the team working on the books. Okay? And this was reinforced by the fact that people working on books, teams working on books, often asked for specific team members to come and join them to work on that book. So this is an actual quote from a real document passed around between some monasteries in France, where they're asking for Margwood, who drew a most magnificent snail rabbit, to come and work with them. So other monasteries, while still working with their own team, ask for members of other teams to come and join them to consult on certain projects. This was often as a direct result of marginalia. So they saw what Margwood, I don't know how to pronounce that, could do, and they asked for him. It was really interesting. So later on, in the late medieval period, booksellers started to have to swear oaths to universities and patrons that they would only act as intermediaries between the seller of books and the buyer of books, and their percentage of profit would only be a certain amount, and it became highly competitive and cutthroat. This is particularly interesting because middlemen started to get involved, and buyers loved to complain about how the middlemen and the storefront had an iron grip on things. So new challengers later came in and started selling things with different percentages and offering different deals to the book producers and the book buyers, and it shook up the status quo, and complaints started rolling in, which was really interesting to see. So this might be a quote that you ring true with. This was a quote from Ireland, where a monastery made a deal with a certain booksellers guild to sell their books at a different rate, and people started complaining. And hopefully this is familiar to some people. There's also content being exclusive to this new guild will not result in sales. And this is real, this is genuine. I'll give you a link at the end where I'll put some citations up later on. It gets better. It gets better. So monasteries couldn't afford to produce these lavish books without funding, so they had patrons, they had lords and dukes and other monasteries funding them. So you get comments like this, where they acknowledge that they would not be able to produce another book if they did not sell their soul to a certain guild or monastery. Very complicated things. But it gets better still, because the consumer of these books also started to complain constantly. This is somebody talking about a book, The Lives of Tresor. The remake, the sequel, was not as good as the previous one, apparently, and that disappointed this fellow. But also they complained about their patrons. The development teams in the monasteries who were funded to build these books complained about the people who were giving them the money. The Duke thinks it's easy to make a manuscript, and he arrives here in our scriptorium and tries to make suggestions. And we pretend to listen. Haven't we all? The king, the reader of our books, asks for another chapter, as if it's a thing we can add in a day. It was at this point that I was just scratching my head and wondering if just everything's destined to happen over and over again. These monasteries where the books were kept and had their books chained down, they even kept analytics. Because the books were chained to the desk, they would know when the person reading them left, because they would just leave them open in the state they were in, and the monks would note that down in their records. So the monks knew when someone gave up and stopped reading, and they knew how much of the book was completed by the reader, so they had analytics, which they could use to tune the future book's content to be the right length. And this allowed them to make clever decisions about the content they were producing. They knew, for example, when you did not read past chapter 4, so they would just half-ass it from then on for the next one. And again, this horrified me as I read more, but you know, it's pretty familiar. Tools and proprietary tools were even a thing. So scribes did their writing on desks that looked kind of similar to a lectern. It was slanted, propped up at an angle of 45 degrees. Arguments sprung up about the precise angle about your desk, how it should be. They even had meetings with other teams to discuss their tooling, and competition for supplying tools, desks, inks, supplies was really cutthroat. Vendors really loved to involve themselves in this, and fierce camps rose up discussing which tools were better. So you get fabulous quotes like this one, where they didn't particularly like the quill from Normandy, and you know, only an idiot would use Normandy's quill to write books of this kind. Completely amateurs. Nobody wants to use Normandy quills. It was pervasive. You know, only an idiot would use a quill from Normandy to write a book. The Duke that requests that we make our manuscript with his favourite tools, but he knows nothing of how they work and he can't tell the difference anyway, so he's probably a fool. The consumers of the media didn't really know how or why the media was created. They just knew what they liked, and they made up things to suit the narrative. So the people working in these teams recognised that and, you know, rolled with it. Oh, and many of the staff, many of the people working on these teams, they were women. Maybe the majority was women, we can't tell because the women have been erased from history in a way that is not uncommon. Prayer books and church documents were often written for the male reader, surprise, and they used the term monk instead of nun uniformly, so we don't actually know who they were written for most of the time. Male-centric was the norm, even when they were probably written by women, so we don't really know anymore, sadly, but we have some extant records that let us see that there were actually probably if not an equal gender split, a lot of women in the industry. Many of the women who allow us to know this now were the ones that took matters into their own hands, where they countered the erasure by writing themselves or inscribing themselves into the manuscripts. This is the Salisbury Psalter, which is from the 10th or 11th century. And the nuns have gone through and replaced all the masculine inflected words with feminine ones. So where an original prayer read, famulum tutum, thy servant, it was rewritten with famulum tuan, thy female servant, and so on and so on and so on. And they've fixed it all the way through. For example, every time it said abbot, they've replaced it with abbess. And they've just basically gone through and erased all the men, which is probably a good practice because we wouldn't have known that when we're working on this at all without examples like this. Other manuscripts have shown similar signs of repurposing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge this stuff because white supremacists now, in today, really love talking about the Middle Ages as an example of a successful white male culture, and it wasn't. So the diversity of medieval European life is astonishing, and women were everywhere, and the people we call English were actually immigrants, and so on and so on and so on. But I really think it's important to point out that medievalists know this, white supremacists do not know this. So point this out anytime you talk about it. Beowulf, has anyone heard of the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf? We would not have that if it was not for a female transcriber, probably, we think, named Ethel, who took the trouble to transcribe it at some point, which is how we still have it. And she left her name in there, secretly, through runes. Really cool stuff. Look that up. I highly recommend it. This next one has some things I've censored. You'll probably figure out what I've censored once you see it. Yes, they're doing exactly what it looks like they're doing. They're gathering them from a tree to put them in a basket. Nobody knows why this is a thing. No, literally nobody. There's papers on this. More papers than you'd expect. So I'm coming up to the end of my talk, but this is an actual history talk. I hope I've demonstrated that you don't actually have to labour too much to make a connection between stuff we're doing now and stuff from the past, and that learning about the past is really important. It's really interesting. One of the things that led me down this path to research this talk was reading some quotes. This is a commentary on medieval art and manuscripts, but it reminds me of video games. So to dismiss their mischief as nothing more than fun and games would be a serious mistake. Yet they tenaciously defy efforts to take them seriously. That reminds me of our industry in a lot of ways. I'm not going to read all these quotes, but there's a lot of quotes that say the same thing. We resist taxonomies, we're not really sure what we are, it's hard to classify us. Their riotous antics mock our most hallowed cultural categories, and they subvert the sacred conventions of culture. At first glance it's topsy-turvy, tangential and garbage, but it's actually an integral part of what we do, is the power behind what we're doing. So I hope you take a think about history and how it can affect the current world, and think about what you can learn from it. And remember, the goose was there all along. This is from 1100. This is the goose, and being taught how to be horrible, presumably, by a fox, and not sure what that is. But he's wearing a fez. Thank you for coming. I really hope you enjoyed my talk. There'll be a write-up on hey.paris, which is a legitimate URL, I assure you, soon, where I'll give you all the citations for this if you want to look at that. It might take me like a week or so, because I'm tired. But I'll do that soon. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to tweet or email me. Please feel free to ask me questions now if you have time, and you should visit Tasmania. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think I have like 10 minutes. If anyone has a question, I'm happy to take a question. I'm not sure what the rules are for questions. There's a microphone there. I don't know if it works, but it probably does.
Hello. I don't know if this is on.
Yes,
Feels
I
on.
can hear you.
This is like watching that snail thing. I've come up with a couple theories. So,
Hit me.
either there were like a lizard people who would control the books and would write spirals in the marginalia, and then later came back and drew snails around the spirals, or there's a breed of spacefaring time snails that have gone back in time and controlled that period of time, which is why it was so dark. What do you feel about these?
I agree with both these theories. There's actually one explanation that we have written down somewhere from like the 14th century in Lombardy in France, where one of the monks was asked directly by like the king, maybe, I'm not sure, his funder, why there were so many snails in one particular work, and his answer was, "We got smashed." That doesn't explain the previous 1,000 years of snails, though. Does anyone actually have a question? I'm happy to make things up. There's one here, maybe.
Hello.
Hello.
Apropos of some preserved graffiti in Pompeii that I think was either a dick or a butt joke.
Yes.
Do we see this sort of, what is it, marginalia or graffiti or just playfulness in cultures outside of Europe?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I have a degree in medieval history focusing on Europe. So my primary knowledge area is Europe. There's a lot of stuff on like Arabic cultures and Asian cultures where this sort of stuff is prevalent as well. I just don't know it as well enough to give a talk about it. So yes, I should have prefixed this whole thing with I'm talking about Europe. But it's everywhere. Humans, turns out, they're really freaking playful no matter what they're doing. And particularly people doing creative work doodle constantly. Anyone got any other questions? Answer? One at the back and one at the front. Okay.
G'day.
Hello.
Just got to know, how long did it take you to put this together? And was there any point where you thought, what am I doing?
Yeah, look, I've been thinking that for years, what am I doing? But no, it took me about 6 months to put this together, of which the last 3 months I decided it was going to be a talk. Previously it was going to be a blog post, or I was just going to make a Twitter thread, or like giggle to myself in the corner without telling anyone about it. There's a lot of that. I don't formally work in history, so I'm not a historian anymore, but I have, as I said, I did a lot of history when I was younger. If I get time, I'll go back and do more formal history training, but I just like doing this stuff for my spare time. It's interesting to me. It keeps me sane.
Thank you kindly.
There's one at the front. Yeah, awesome.
Hi there.
Hello.
Are there any resources you can point to that focus on, I guess, a more holistic global history to kind of give a brief overview of, I guess, all of human history without a kind of Eurocentric?
From a playful point of view, or from a writing point of view, from a which perspective?
Yes. No, from like a just general history point of view.
Sure, I will put some notes about that in the blog post I write for you, because I think there's a lot of interesting resources here. Sure, I can't really answer that now, but yes, I can give you some pointers. Anyone else have 6 minutes?
Hi.
Hello.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I just wondered, within medievalism, is there kind of the same pushback against the study of marginalia as we sort of tend to see or have seen in sort of cultural studies and media studies against games and other playful media?
I wouldn't say pushback. I would say it's not taken very seriously, except by a couple of historians. Most of them are just like, oh, those wacky medieval people and their stupid snails. And there's like one woman, Gail something or other, from one of the American like Midwest universities, who constantly writes papers on this, and she has this really sassy blog where she basically just says, oh, I turned up at this serious conference again and they just laughed at me. So she's constantly writing these things, and people are really serious historians don't really care about marginalia until recently. I think it's got a whole new life recently on Twitter because it's funny. It makes it like a little funny tweet. And there's quite a few marginalia accounts. If you search Twitter for marginalia, you'll find a whole bunch of accounts that just tweet these out of context because they're funny to look at. And I think that's meant it's being taken a little more seriously recently, paradoxically, because people are seeing it and it's becoming something that people can capitalize on. But actual historians don't really care about it because it's mostly incidental to what they're looking at. So you get a lot of historians of like the written word who are not medievalists who like it, but then it's only a slice of the whole widespread of things they're looking at. Whereas medievalists are more interested in something very specific. One thing you learn when you study history a lot is medievalists usually are very, very specific in their interests. So they're very interested in like one particular order of nuns and the fabric they use for their clothes or something like that. It's really interesting. They specialize to a fault. And that means they often exclude things that are outside that. Yeah. But yes, it's pretty common.
Talking about the things that's not like super specific about medieval studies, do you know the Book of Mortality?
Yes.
I just wonder if like how do I look up this online? Because I just read this, I think, from one Twitter message.
Okay.
But I don't know where to look up for more about.
So you want to read it? You want to look at it? I'll put some links in my blog post for you.
Oh, thank you very much.
I've got some citations about that already. Yep. Does anyone else have any? I probably have time for like 2 more questions, I reckon, before I'm going to slowly pass out in a corner. Oh, one more. There we go. Here. No. 2. Okay. Sorry. I'll stop pointing to people.
If they were under the pump time-wise so much,
Yes,
why were they allowed to do such extravagant illustrations in the books?
because nobody else could do what they did, and there were so few of them, it was a really in-demand industry. Hopefully this still sounds familiar. Yeah, they were allowed to do what they did because nobody else could do it to the same level. The level of training required to get good at this was so high that there were so few of them, that while they couldn't demand ridiculous salaries, they had to be taken seriously on some level. So, yeah, they were allowed to do this because it was a self-promotion thing that was necessary. I'll probably take one more question before I slowly fall over. Yeah.
Hi again.
Hello.
In regards to, so there are definitely some more playful examples and texts shown in the presentation. Are there examples of marginalia, playfulness, and other forms of creative art in like a serious text such as the Malleus Maleficarum?
Yes, many of these are from quite serious texts. The more serious the text, the sillier it gets usually, but there's probably less of them. So anything, let me think about how to phrase this. The more serious texts were duplicated more often, which means they were more consistent. So you find the more ridiculous things in the ones that were duplicated for like a handful of times rather than en masse. So the stuff that was important and serious got duplicated a lot, which meant there was less time to do it, which means there were less of them. But when they did it, it was sillier. So hopefully that answers your question. But basically, yes, it's in really serious stuff, but not as frequently. But when it's there, it's much, much sillier. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go fall over now, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me or find me. I'll be at all the parties in the rest of the week. And please bookmark my site or take a photo, and I'll post a thing there within a week or so. Thank you very much.